You're about to witness what Louis Theroux really thinks about the Jewish people. You see, he invited Bob Villin, aka Pascal Robinson Foster, if you will, onto his podcast. And the conversation that unfolded was one of the most egregious examples of classical anti-Semitism that I think I've seen from any mainstream journalist.
You did your show, the Free Palestine chant went up, and then you said something along the lines of, forgive me if it's not verbatim, I've got a new one for you. And then it's like, okay, what's this going to be? And it was death to the IDF. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking around thinking like, okay, that's raised it up a notch for sure. Fuck the IDF, I think, dispassionately, like, would be quite relatively easy to defend, I think, from that political position, right? Mm-hmm. Death to the IDF is obviously a step up from that. What does it mean?
What does it mean? Literally what it says, death to the Israel Defense Forces. And in that name, defense is the operative word. You see, Israel is surrounded by 140 million people on its literal borders that wish its destruction. And the only thing that's holding back hordes of jihadi groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Daesh, the only thing holding these groups back are the Israel Defense Forces. And when Bob Dylan wishes death upon them, if he were to get his way, we would witness the biggest massacre of Jews in our history.
Do you stand by the chant, and would you chant that on stage now?
Oh, yeah. Like what? If I was to go on Glastonbury again tomorrow, yeah, I would do it again. I'm not regretful of it. What is there to regret? Or because I've upset some right-wing politicians, some right-wing media?
Right-wing politicians and right-wing media. You heard that. Now, the trouble with that statement is, just a few minutes earlier, Louis had given an example of one of the people that he'd offended, that he'd upset. So let's see who Bob Villin is describing as right-wing politicians or media.
Oh, who else have we got? I mean, we sort of talked about this. The UK's chief rabbi, Ephraim Mervis, called the episode a national shame. He said toxic Jew hatred is a threat to our entire society.
Did you see the smirk that crept across his face? Now ask yourself a question. If the chief rabbi represents British Jews, which he does, who takes delight in upsetting or causing them distress? What kind of a person?
But I do think it's fair to say that there's a lot of nervousness in the Jewish community in general. Is that in your head at all? The possibility of like creating an unsafe atmosphere for the Jewish community?
Me creating an unsafe atmosphere?
Well, that's what you've been accused of, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think I have created an unsafe atmosphere for the Jewish community.
Did you see that the smirk was back? Actually, this time it was a full-on gleeful smile at the thought that Jews were feeling unsafe and that he may have contributed to that. At least that was the accusation from Louis. And as for the creation of a certain sense of nervousness, I think Louis said, amongst the Jewish community, a little context is key here. This interview is just a few weeks after the worst anti-Semitic incident in British history since the year 1190. And newsflash, both Louis Theroux and Bob Villin contributed to the climate that culminated in this anti-Semitic incident, in which a terrorist went to a Jewish synagogue in Manchester on our holiest day of the year and murdered Jews. Now, Louis contributes because he poured fuel on the fire. He created a documentary, a follow-up documentary, in which he found the most extreme fringe Jews that he could and presented their views as Israel, as Zionism, without any balance, without any nuance, without any counterbalance. He never made a video on radical Islam. In fact, in his entire career, he's never once made a video about radical Islam. Why is it? Why is it that Louis Theroux will demonize Jews and make us look as extreme as he possibly can? But there's no such documentary about the counterposition in the Islamic world, in the Muslim world, even in the Palestinian world. Where's the Palestinian documentary that focuses on Palestinian extremism? Because believe me, it's there, but he hasn't made the documentary. He's never once portrayed them in a negative light. And let's just step back and think for a minute. Let's take the most extreme Jew he was able to find, the furthest right he could. What was that Jew saying? That Jew was saying, I want a Jewish homeland so my people can escape the tyranny of those that have persecuted us for thousands of years. Now, what would the Palestinian counterpart say? What would, say, a Hamas militant say? They would say, we want to establish a global khilafah and dominate all the non-Muslims, the infidels in the world. We want to make them one of the dhimma, if they're Christians or Jews. God help them if they're not. And we want to force them to pay the jizya, a Jewish Christian tax, until they're sagirun, humiliated. Now, which is more extreme? Global domination and total oppression of those that don't belong to your religion, or a Jewish state where Jews can escape the tyranny of those that have persecuted us for thousands of years?
The fight is against white supremacy, right? Like, that is what the fight is against. And I think white supremacy is displayed so vividly in Zionist.
This is just galling. Did you see Louis Theroux just nodding and ming along as Bob Villan says that white supremacy is most vividly displayed in Zionism? This is such a perverse corruption and rewriting of history. Zionism is a reaction to white supremacy. Zionists, Jews, were persecuted by white Europeans for not being white enough. The most horrendous example of this being the Holocaust. And just years after, 3 years after the massacre of 6 million Jews by white supremacists, Israel was founded. Israel was intended as a refuge for the victims of white supremacy. And these monsters want to rewrite history and make you think that it is a white supremacist project.
People have written about viewing the Zionist movement and the war crimes being committed by Israel through the lens of white supremacy. And I think you can see it quite clearly when you start to look at the relationship between Israel and the United States, for example, where American police, American law enforcement have direct relationships with the IDF and are sent there to train. In Georgia, they have something called the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange Program, and it has been sending people to Israel to train for the last 31 years. And those tactics are then exported directly to the US soil, and they are then used, as we know, disproportionately in black and brown communities. So I think it's important to not just view what Israel is doing as like, they want to call it a war or a conflict. It's a genocide, but it's not an isolated thing. It needs to be looked at and viewed through the wider lens of white supremacy and the impact that it has on people of color throughout the world.
This is now unbridled anti-Semitism in its most raw and ugly form. Bob Villan is trying to blame Jews for all the evils he dislikes. Racism around the world, that's now the Zionists. Jews as a collective, that's who's behind it. In reality, the inverse is true. It's Jews that are unsafe around the world because of anti-Zionists, not people of colour that are at risk or unsafe because of Zionists. How many Jewish Zionists are going into churches or mosques and murdering people of a different religion? No, it's the other way round. The anti-Zionists are coming to our places of worship and killing us wherever they find us.
I think I'd add to that, there's an even more macro lens which you can put on it, which is that Jewish identity and the Jewish community as expressed in Israel has become almost like an acceptable, quote unquote, way of understanding ethno-nationalism. And so it's like they're prototyping an aggressive militarized form of ethno-nationalism, which is then rolled out, whether it's by people like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Trump in the US. It's become there's a certain sense of post-Holocaust Jewish exceptionalism or Zionist exceptionalism.
Wait, did I hear that right? Let's just play that again.
A certain sense of post-Holocaust Jewish exceptionalism or Zionist exceptionalism has become a role model on the national stage for what these white identitarians would like to do in their own countries.
This is so perverse. So perverse. To accuse Israel of ethno-nationalism is insane. When you look at the diversity of Israel, there's 2 million Arabs that live in Israel. They have complete equality with Jews. Arab judges have sent Jewish prime ministers and Jewish presidents to jail. Arabs serve in the government, they serve in the military. In contrast, there are 0 Palestinian Jews. The Jews were ethnically cleansed by the Arabs, and they have a law that literally bans us from citizenship. But he wants to accuse us of being the ethno-nationalists without ever shining a light on the side he's defending. And as for the accusation of militarism, and it's what? Why is Israel so militaristic? Why is there a conscription army? Why is a large percentage of the population trained to defend its borders? Because we've been attacked by multiple Arab armies since our very inception. In fact, our entire experience of living in this land, even before the State of Israel, has been one of persecution and violence. The reason that Israel has the military it has is because it faces a consistent existential threat. But I think the most egregious, the most disappointing thing that Louis said in that diatribe was that Zionism is post-Holocaust Jewish exceptionalism. Jewish exceptionalism. He then quickly corrects himself and says Zionist exceptionalism. Louis, Zionism is not post-Holocaust Jewish exceptionalism. Zionism is Jewish survival. Zionism has saved hundreds of thousands of Jews from oppression, from Russia, from Africa, from the Arab world. Where are the Jews of the Arab world? There used to be 850,000 Jews in the Arab world. They've been chased out. There are now more Jews in a synagogue in North London than the entire Arab world combined. And where did they go? Where did they flee when they were forced from their homes that they'd lived in for millennia? They fled to Israel. Just like the victims of the Holocaust, the survivors of the Holocaust, fled to Israel. Zionism is not post-Holocaust Jewish exceptionalism. Zionism is Jewish survival.
So I think there's a lot of cynicism about, because I think actually a lot of the people who claiming to act as like friends of the Jewish community, that's the thin end of a wedge that will end up excluding Jewish people and excluding anyone who doesn't match the description of kind of traditional British racial type.
Louis, I've got some news for you. The Jewish victims of anti-Semitism aren't fleeing European white identitarians. They're fleeing anti-Zionists. They're fleeing you. I fled from you. My family lived in the UK for generations. We loved it. We called it home, but we no longer feel safe there, and many of us are leaving. I left. Both you and Bob have fanned the flames of this fire, a fire that's created an inferno of anti-Semitism that's consuming Europe, that's consuming the West. Louis, it's not the white identitarians that concern us. It's you.